China and Philippines strategies to frustrate each other, using hard and soft power over the second Thomas Shoal. The verbal exchanges between China and the Philippines have continued to become more heated as both countries exchange verbal barbs and accusations over altercations in the second Thomas Shoals in the South China Sea. The public statements by two countries does not show that either are willing to back down and are choosing paths that appear to intentionally antagonize the other. The antagonizing strategy is around the Philippines' need to form alliances to counter China's claims and China's stubborn insistence that all matters around China's claims in the South China Sea be affirmed and diplomatically addressed through bilateral talks only. The strategy pathway chosen by each country is one that is not based on compromise, but is based on insisting the solving of the dispute requires the other country to seek terms that are the most advantage to their adversary. The dispute over the second Thomas Shoal is based on China's unilateral claim of the so-called Nine-Dash Line. The Nine-Dash Line is a maritime claim in the South China Sea with a line appearing on the map for each of the 9 sets of islands and rocks that China claims as the border of it for its sovereign territorial claims of the South China Sea. China, after the discovery of oil and gas and other natural resources in these waters, claimed the maritime territory as China's based on dubious claim that has little support in the international maritime law or in Chinese history. This area is also the most lucrative maritime trade route in the world, with 60% of maritime trade passing through it. This is the territory that China claims as its own, and that any country that passes through this area without the permission is trespassing on Chinese sovereign territory, and the country that inhabits islands along or inside the Nine-Dash Line are also violating Chinese sovereignty, according to China. The Chinese Communist Party relies on its Coast Guard and maritime militia to patrol the South China Sea, seeking to intimidate minor powers and diplomatically protest major powers' presence in the region and what it claims are violations of its territory. The Chinese Foreign Ministry attempts to portray its tactics as the country trying to act reasonably towards the countries that will not accept the reasoned claims of China. China's strategy is one that is trying to prevent the formation of coalitions to resist its claims by calling on countries not to bring any outside countries into the disputes in the South China Sea and to rely solely on bilateral talks to resolve the issue. Relying on bilateral talks is a significant advantage to China, especially when involving smaller powers, and nearly all powers in the region are smaller powers when compared to China. China prefers this method because it can use its economic military advantage to threaten any power that attempts to defy China's claims. A small country cannot compete with China's power and will either give in to China's demands or avoid any action that may raise the ire of China. Thus, China can use its strategy to intimidate most of the region into compliance. Also, by insisting on keeping all disputes bilateral, it is a way for China to warn against countries into bringing the United States, which has no claims in the South China Seas, outside of free navigation of international waters. This is the strategy that China wants the Philippines to follow in its disputes in the South China Sea, but so far have been frustrated by the intransigence of Filipino President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. President Marcos, who is more pro-United States, unlike his predecessor, Rodrigo Duterte, who was more pro-Chinese. The current and former president are also rivals, with Duterte accusing Marcos of being a drug addict and is campaigning to gather signatures to push a secession in Mindanao. President Marcos states that any attempt by Mindanao to secede will be met with military force. Another complication in this rivalry is that the former President Duterte's daughter, Sara Duterte, is the current vice president of the Philippines. China is angling to find ways to exploit this rivalry inside the Philippines, with Chinese President Xi Jinping calling on Duterte to directly improve ties between the countries. With the bitter rivalry between Duterte and Marcos and Sara Duterte's role as vice president, it appears that China is also trying to interfere in the internal affairs of the Philippines to weaken Marcos's presidency. Marcos will be less likely to put up a strong front against China If his domestic political power weakens due to Duarte's threatening to return to politics and most likely serve China's position, or if a secession attempt is made in Mindanao. The Chinese are attempting to interfere in Filipino politics as a way to get the Philippines to submit to China's claims. The reason that China has returned to interfering with the internal affairs of the Philippines is due to the Philippines' strategy to confront China's claims in the South China Sea, and it was one that maximizes the Philippines' position. The Philippines, under Marcos, has been improving ties with the United States and has reminded China that Philippines has a defense alliance with the United States that he is willing to call upon in case China resorts to force in the Second Thomas Shoal. The Philippines has also been attempting to foster relations with other countries that have territorial disputes in the South China Sea and conducting multilateral defense exercises in the region with those minor powers. These include exercises that have included the U.S., Japan, the United Kingdom, and Vietnam. The use of forming multilateral alliances is a frustration for China in that it is less likely to intimidate smaller countries due to increased strength of numbers. Also, it is harder to play countries off each other if China must negotiate with all of them simultaneously. The other factor that plays in the Philippines' favor is the geographic position of the Philippines, which would be a significant stretch of the Chinese military capabilities. This is especially true if Taiwan is still independent, and that the Chinese would most likely encounter the U.S. Navy while at the same time being well out of the range of the Chinese mainland's Air Force. China's naval capabilities to maintain a fleet with limited aircraft carrier capability around the Philippines is in doubt, especially when it would have to project around an independent Taiwan. The Philippines have chosen a strategy that gives them the advantage in that China's challenge to project force to the Philippines, and the Philippines has the option to rely on the security of its geography and the alliance with the United States. A war with the Philippines is a war that China does not want, which strengthens the Philippines' hand. This does not mean that the tensions will quiet down in the future as China accepts the military reality of a war with the Philippines. The Chinese apparently will move away from negotiations and threat of military force and one of weakening President Marcos politically by propping up an unstable and pro-Chinese Duarte to create an internal rivalry and possibly a crisis either through secession of Mindanao or a political crisis by also encouraging a split between Vice President Sara Duarte and President Marcos. Creating a political domestic crisis will be exacerbated by Chinese pressure on the Second Thomas Shoal and frustrating the Philippine resupply efforts to the Sierra Madre. The Sierra Madre is a Philippine Navy ship that was intentionally grounded in the Second Thomas Shoal and now serves as a military outpost to bolster the Philippines' claim in the shoal. The ship is maintained by about 24 Marines and have short tours on the ship and also must be resupplied by sea. The Chinese can continue to be a nuisance and contest the resupply to create additional crisis for pro-Chinese elements in the Philippines. Also, the Sierra Madre dates to World War II and is old, and at this point is falling apart. The ship needs to be repaired to keep it from collapsing, but that is doubtful that it can be done while under active Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia interdiction. The Chinese could choose a strategy of keeping up the current pressure and allow the ship to collapse, which will force the Philippines' evacuation of its maritime contingent. The Chinese strategy in the Philippines' claims in the Second Thomas Shoal needs to change due to the Philippines' strategy in its alliance with the United States. It can choose interference in the domestic affairs of the Philippines and or wait out the eventual forced evacuation of the Sierra Madre, though that is hard to predict and when that will happen. The Philippines needs to keep up the strategy as well to keep Chinese in check, but also needs to seek ways to reinforce its claims in the Second Thomas Shoal and find ways to counter Chinese interference in Filipino domestic affairs so China cannot win in the South China Sea by simply collapsing the Philippines' resolve internally.